You are listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the 1984 3D comedy horror anthology film, Tales of the Third Dimension. Here we go. You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau, as we continue our 3D summer, as we continue watching these movies from the 80s in the third dimension. Pete, are you ready for another installment in our journey?
I mean, I feel like the movie we're going to discuss now, Bernie, is pretty apropos because I feel like we are living our own tales of the third dimension with this journey that we've been on to try. And what I think, I won't speak for you, but I think you'll agree, like at the time, like, yeah, we'll cover all the 80s 3D movies. That won't take too long because, you know, it was like Friday the 13th, Amityville 3D, Jaws 3D, Space Hunter, Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared Sin. Maybe there's one or two others in there. And then that'll be a fun little jaunt. We are on month 2, 3.
Feels like month 8.
We are in year 7. This is renewed for a 7th season of 80s 3D movies. No, we keep uncovering more. And Earl Owensby, if you've listened to any of our previous episodes where we talk about Earl Owensby 3D movies such as Rottweiler, a.k.a. Dogs of Hell, and Chain Gang, you'll know that he is a recent discovery for Bernie and myself, and we are fully invested in going down this rabbit hole. And so we are back for more Earl Owensby gold. We are mining for it. Sometimes we don't quite hit pay dirt, but you know, we keep going. And so today, whenever you're listening to it, this morning, dusk, we're talking about Tales of the Third Dimension.
You've reached that final crossroad and entered another dimension. A dimension from which there is no return, no escape. A dimension of sight, sound, mind, body, etc., etc., etc. It is the beginning of the end. There's no turning back now. Welcome to Tales of the Third Dimension.
A anthology film, very much in line with Crypt or the HBO series
Tales from the Crypt.
Tales from the Crypt. Thank you, Bernie. To nobody's surprise that knows anything about Earl, who was a flagrant ripper-offer, he does it again with Tales of the Third Dimension, where we've got our own crypt keeper named Igor, who could have used some eyelids.
Love it.
Introduces 3 tales, backed by a couple of groups of turkeys or vultures, or perhaps turkey vultures, who sound and act quite a bit like some famous Hollywood stars.
Anytime we bring up animatronic vultures, I've got to throw in my 2 cents, especially when they're modeled after Laurel and Hardy and the Three Stooges. The whole time they're just making snide comments as Igor is basically the bridge right between segments. He's our horror host.
A little bit like, you know, Rich Little doing Rod Serling.
Yes.
Or if you want to bring it into more modern times, maybe like Frank Caliendo doing Rod Serling.
My name is Igor.
Igor? Say, that's some fancy moniker. Quiet, mouse breath, or I'll rip out your tonsils.
I thought his name was Clyde.
So did I.
Why do you suppose he changed it?
Now, how should I know?
Maybe he thinks Igor has more dignity than Clyde.
Well, it's a little late for him to be concerned about that.
Now, how shall I entertain you?
And I think this is where, just like Pete said, Earl Owensby, a man who was very aware, he makes Frank Challenge Manhunter, and it's basically a ripoff of Walking Tall.
I saw Walking Tall. People say Gone with the Wind influenced me. Gone with the Wind didn't influence me at all. Walking Tall influenced me because Walking Tall was made over in McMinnville, Tennessee for about $1,300,000 with Joe Don Baker playing Buford Purser, and the sucker did about $40 million. Now, $40 million back then was a whole lot of money. We wasn't into these $100 million mega blockbusters at that time. And I said, that's the kind of film I need to do.
He makes Tales of the from the Third Dimension. And like Pete said, Tales from the Crypt, both the 1972 movie, the HBO, right? Tales from the Dark Side, all the stuff that we kind of grew up on. And I think at times, I appreciated the effort. It was very much in the tone of the things that inspired Tales from the Dark Side and Tales from the Crypt, the EC comics, right? Weird Tales, Haunts of Fear. You could tell he's dipping into that. Doesn't always work, but this was fun. The gift that keeps on giving in Earl Owensby, like you mentioned, we watched Friday the 13th, first time watches of Silent Madness and Coming at You, movies that we were not aware of, that were very much a part, and in Coming at You, arguably started the 80s 3D trend, and to realize that in that group picture, if there was a family reunion, Pete, of every 80s 3D movie, Tales from the Third Dimension in 3D would be there. And I just want to throw this out there. Doesn't it feel like saying ATM machine? So when you say automatic teller machine, isn't saying Tales from the Third Dimension in 3D just feel like you're just saying it twice?
That's a great point. I'm not sure how much thought went into deep diving the title, but and I got to go back real quick to the Three Stooges. An artist showing some restraint would be like, I got a great idea. We've got some animatronic vultures. Statler and Waldorf are funny, right? What if we have it as like the Three Stooges? And then Earl's like, buddy, we're fucking going balls to the wall. We're adding in Laurel and Hardy. Like most places would be like, or most productions would be like, we don't need both because that's too much star power. Earl's like, no fucking way. We can get all the star power we can get. So you get me animatronic Three Stooges, you get me animatronic Laurel and Hardy, and we're going to have a fucking party.
And then maybe a slight insult to the word animatronic, because there's not much movement.
Their heads kind of bop up and down. Some of their mouths open.
I'm imagining those rod puppets where their head is literally on a rod and somewhere underneath, moving things around, ruffling the feathers slightly just to indicate movement. That's the movie that we had the pleasure of watching, Pete. Tales from the Third Dimension, and the three segments that really make up this like hour and a half movie. Again, like most Earl Owensby films, not available on Blu-ray, not available on DVD. It's not like you can go get a European or German cut. It's not like we were avoiding paying money for this. You're going to find this on YouTube. You're going to find that it was uploaded from a really crappy VHS. And you know what? Damn it. Like, be happy you got that, because this thing is not easy to find. It doesn't look great, but we did the work, Pete, and we found it.
And for all of those After Effects and Premiere and Final Cut people out there that, like to dress up their modern videos with that old 80s VHS aesthetic, you watch this version that we saw on YouTube, you get VHS tracking, and that's the real deal, baby. That's the real fucking thing. So you got to sit through a good 30 seconds of one of the stories where there's like tracking issues, but you love it because you're like, yep, this is what I remember. This is what I grew up with. This is great. I agree with you. I had a lot of fun with this one because having grown up with Creepshow, Tales from the Dark Side, watched some Tales of the Crypt, we know a lot of those stories at this point,
Yep.
Like birthday cake. It's my birthday, Bedelia. That first Creepshow, fantastic. But we know those stories. And so I was like, okay, so here's going to be an anthology. I have no idea what stories we're about to watch. So I go in completely blind. I'm like, this is great. Tell me some stories, like some short form attempts at scares, and maybe not so much attempts at scares, although the middle story plays it straight for the most part. The
Yes.
first and third definitely try to lean more into comedy, I guess. Mm-hmm. One term one could use for
that's a term. I would agree. Yeah. and I think that's where watching these, I was actually more impressed that they went again, having not made a film and always impressed by people who do kind of make things like this. You always kind of hear comedy is one of the hardest things you can do. You got to appeal to a lot of folks, and comedy is so specific. And the fact that they actually didn't it almost, you could argue, say it was easier if they had just gone with these 3 26, 28-minute segments that just were straight, just gothic horror, atmospheric, an Alfred Hitchcock Presents, One Step Beyond, like something simple like that, right? Very much, Tales from the Crypt. But instead, some of these episodes, at least 2 of them, very much would have fit in the Tales of the Crypt. And I'm talking like not the 1972, the Amicus Productions, the 90s HBO series. Like it would have been like an episode we might have watched, or even better, something like Ray Bradbury Theater. Have you ever seen that?
Oh, yeah, sure.
But because, we're going down the Earl Owensby road and we're looking at these 80s 3D films, the three segments were fun. It was fun to watch this movie.
Yeah, I agree. My light criticism, and again, I am not a writer of film. I've taken a stab at a screenplay once. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. So I have a lot of respect for anyone attempting to do it. But I'd say my light criticism of this, the writing hurts it a little bit. There are interesting stories. The 3 episodes I think are interesting. Execution could have been done a bit better. I think where it fell short a little bit for me was, and this is tough to do, because what Rod Serling did with the Twilight Zone and Night Gallery, not just that he had a presence, but he was able to write himself doing a lead-in and then a wrap-up of what you were about to see and had just seen. And what they try to do with Igor, where he's trying to give like this overarching theme and morality play type thing, but it doesn't quite work. Like,
yes,
what he's saying, yes, it makes some sense, but it's not really tying in the story. And I think if that was a little bit tighter, it would have been better. But again, we're talking about an Earl Owensby low budget ripoff of Creepshow. Take what you can get. And I very much enjoyed watching these 3 vignettes.
Yes. So all right, let's dig into these segments, because again, the motivation for the 3D, right? Like Igor is there to literally point his finger at the screen, to have an eyeball pop out at the screen. He's there to bring us Marvin the Bat, who makes an appearance. And it's literally a bat on a string. That's what you're getting with this. And it's leaning into the gimmick of 3D. We know what you're doing, but also we can appreciate all the little strings and the bats that are being used here. It's like, okay, we get it. We know what you're doing. All right, we got to get into the first story here, Pete. Youngblood, directed by Tom McIntyre. I'm going to guess that's how it's pronounced. And he actually wrote almost all the films that were produced by Owensby. Kind of goes back into a reoccurring theme. If you've listened to these Earl Owensby produced movies, we've talked about some of the same cast members or musicians that have scored it. In this case, also Dee Barton, who worked on Chain Gang. And in Chain Gang, kind of works with that sort of like swampy, Louisiana, Cajun kind of music that works for Chain Gang. In this one, atmospheric. That's what this was. So totally worked. And in the first story, we get the Count, played by Robert Bloodworth. He goes by Bob in the credits. He was actually Lord Buckethead in Hyperspace / Gremloids.
He's also the head corrections officer in Chain Gang.
He is indeed. And he's in Rottweiler too. I was trying to picture who he was in Rottweiler, and I thought he might have been like the developer guy who comes in meeting with the mayor, or the mayor.
Was he the bar owner that tries to karate chop a Rottweiler?
That's who he was. He was 100% the bar owner. Thank you, Pete. That's Robert Bob Bloodworth. He's the Count. And turns out the fun concept in this one is that you've got basically Mr. and Mrs. Dracula, the Count and the Countess, trying to adopt the kid. And then hilarity ensues, right? Especially when the kid they adopt is a problem child. Then we get that O. Henry twist that you saw in Tales from the Dark Side and Twilight Zone. And that's kind of where the fun happens, because really you've got 20-some minutes, and it's those last 5 minutes where they kind of ratchet it up.
Yes, it definitely, from the get-go, it plays kind of comedically. So I'm like, all right, so this is going to be a light touch.
The simple fact is, we have a strong desire, my dear Miss Marquette, to adopt a child, and have selected you to make all the necessary arrangements.
There'll be no problem.
Now, wait a minute, Miss Marquette. You know perfectly well adoption is not so easily organized. Forgive my outburst, Mr.
Count.
Mr. Count. But there are literally hundreds of forms that need to be filled out. And then there's the, investigation. There's a thorough investigation.
The bureaucratic red tape involved in the adoption of children is not unknown to us, Mr. Dudley.
Indeed, It is ridiculous the pain which must be endured in order to have young blood in the household. Ridiculous. Out there are hundreds of thousands of poor, homeless waifs, children who must wander the night. Their red blood crying out for roots. Utterly ridiculous.
Do not excite yourself, my darling.
Yes, I forget myself. Please, forgive my outburst.
There's nothing to forgive. Personally, I like to see a man of passionate beliefs expound.
Yes, well, all of that is well and good, Miss Marquette. But we mustn't forget, all applicants have to be judged as suitable parents. Even Mr. and Mrs. Count.
It's Count and Countess, Dudley.
Thank you, Miss Marquette. However rudely he may put it, Mr. Dudley is quite correct.
Immediately, I'm intrigued. I'm like, this is interesting. You've got the Count and the Countess. I'm like, they're either definitely going to be vampires, or this is going to be, like you said, this is going to be like an O. Henry twist that something else is going on. But yes, no, they are vampires. Robert Bloodworth doing his best Romanian Transylvanian accent.
That's right.
Yeah, they want to adopt a child. They bring down their other adopted children. And, there's a lot of talk about needing fresh blood in the house and all that. So like very on the nose stuff. Maybe the worst werewolf transformation scene ever committed.
Yeah, it's not The Howling. It's not American Werewolf.
Rob Bottin and
he was not available for this.
Rob Bottin was sleeping easy after watching this.
That's right. Yeah, and especially I think in this one where the tongue in cheek, they don't have like the Chris Sarandon style vampire from Fright Night. Like he's not trying to be modern. Like these guys are very much like Peter Cushing's, Christopher Lee, like, Rob Langella, like, they're going for the popped collars with the thick Transylvania accents, I guess, by way of South Carolina in this case. They're kind of going for it, which in some ways I think actually helps it because it's so, like you said, on the nose. And that's an interesting premise. Dracula and his wife want to adopt a kid. But like you mentioned, spoiler alert, the kid turns out to be a werewolf. So it's a fun premise. I'm like, okay, like I like the idea behind it, but it slowed down for me like in the middle where it felt like, guys, could we not have done the thing where like they adopt this kid in the first few minutes and maybe the adoption folks have to come back? And man, it seemed like good high concept, like you were saying, but the execution at times was like, oh man, like this could have been a bit more fun.
Yeah, I agree. And you've got like Ms. Marquette is the female adoption agency played by Fran Taylor. She is kind of under the Count's sway.
Yes.
So she's all about like just disregarding any rules as far as adoption. We'll get you the child that you need.
Yeah.
And Dudley, very much like the put upon.
He's the bureaucrat.
Yeah, total bureaucrat. He's like, what's even going on here? But then the extra twist turns out to be that he is the werewolf's father. So he shows up at the end, and the son is reverted back to human form after he's killed the Count and the Countess. And he's like, can we go home now, Dad? He's like, we're done. And so that was like the added little stinger to this episode. But yeah, I mean, it's a fun, interesting premise. It executed a little bit better. I think it would have worked better. It kind of had like that feel of the Leslie Nielsen episode of Creep Show where there's like that comedic element to it, but there's also supposed to be some horror, but there's really not. I mean, there's horrors. I'm going to use that term lightly with this movie.
Yes. Tongue firmly in cheek. All right, so I've got one question, one comment, and one piece of trivia for you, Pete.
Okay.
Comments. I'll start with that one. Kent Terry, probably butchering his last name. Sorry, Kent. He was the kid who played the kid who was adopted in this. He just had that look of every child actor that was in like a 70s to 80s sitcom. And there were times where he's not on the screen for that long, but between the bowl haircut and just that look on his face, I'm like, you grew up to be someone, didn't you, kid? Turns out his IMDb was empty. I couldn't find anything about this. Just, you had that look.
Absolutely. I if you told me that this kid guest starred on 8 is Enough, absolutely he did.
Yep. If he was a teenager in V, the TV series, I would have said, yep, that's him. That's the kid.
Yeah, he was Mark Singer's son.
Yes. That's kind of that look.
I really just pulled that out of my ass, but it kind of works. So we should start that rumor and just really get that rolling.
Unless the guy's like a successful insurance agent somewhere like South Carolina, and he's like, guys, I thought I outlived this. Like, I don't want the past coming back. Question, what do you think happened to those other adopted kids? Because it turns out that this problem child, the werewolf, is not the Count and Countess's first adopted kid. Do you think our werewolf kid ripped them to shreds? Did they just disappear?
I want to believe that they were spared and they're probably locked up in an attic where they will slowly die from malnourishment and lack of water.
Okay. Or they went to the next town over, Jerusalem, aka Salem's Lot.
Became hiking buddies with Danny Glick.
Piece of trivia for you. So I guess this was ripped off, knowingly or not, from a comic book, The Haunt of Fear, issue 24, called The Secret. And I'll read you the description, and you tell me if you hear anything that sounds vaguely familiar. A young boy is adopted by a couple who turn out to be vampires and only want to fatten him up to drain his blood. The surprise on them, though, as he turns out to be a werewolf and tears them to shreds.
Yeah, that's spot on. I feel like some variation of that story has probably been told in comics years.
Yeah, it just feels like a ripe tale for, like I said, all those AC comics, weird tales, or in this case, it was, from Haunt of Fear when they were making a lot of those 40s, 50s horror comics. So this one being the first segment, I was like, we're off to the races. Like, this is good. Like, this is what I would expect, maybe better than I would expect. So I'm like, okay, I'm interested to see what else you guys got.
I found it interesting that Igor, in the segment in between, before we get to the second story, in his wrap-up, was basically saying how vampires are no match for werewolves, throwing the gauntlet down. And I wonder what Kate Beckinsale and Bill Nye Underworld have to say about that, because that this is like well before Tales of the Third Dimension. They kicked off that conversation first. So
that's right.
Everyone with even a rudimentary grasp on life's system of checks and balances knows vampires are no match for a werewolf. Everyone, it appears, except the vampires. But perhaps the Count and Countess were blinded to those facts by the scintillating joys of parenthood. I fervently trust you won't be as myopic as they.
How do you like that? The kid turned out to be a traitor.
Yeah, a regular Arnold Benedict.
That's a Benedict Arnold, numbskull.
I hope you learned a lesson from that. I certainly did. Werewolves are hard to house train.
Yeah? Oh, never mind.
All right, second segment, The Guardians, directed by Worth Keeter, a name that we have said many times before. The man directed Rottweiler, a.k.a. Dogs of Hell, also turned out to direct a bunch of episodes of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. He directed our second segment, The Guardians, that features another name we're familiar with, Leon Rippey, who was in Chain Gang and now shows up as Freddy, one of our duo of grave robbers.
And I like this one too. So as I mentioned, this one plays it mostly straight. I was intrigued that they went to a story that takes place in, never really said, it looks like the 1800s, maybe. So to kind of take something and make it more of a period piece, I'm like, oh, okay. I thought we're going to keep these all kind of like modern tales. So they've already thrown a curveball at me. Then I'm like, all right, where's this going to go?
And I think just to qualify that, again, Earl Owensby, who was mindful of his budget and didn't lose money out of his films.
Let's have no question about it. Earl went into the motion picture industry because it's been a love of his from the very beginning. But he did it principally as a financial venture. And as Earl says, economics is easy. You don't spend as much as you take in. And he was able to do that and build a very successful studio.
Period piece equals money. Like, you have to spend more on costuming, on wardrobe, on set design. And you can tell that, there are some sets that are very much 100% cardboard, but, you guys are putting some money on the screen here. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And you've got there's a bit of a mishmash of costuming going on. Like the opening scene, there's a funeral going on for a woman that's just died. Men wearing bowler hats that suggest the 1800s, and then you've got other men wearing gaiters that almost seems like 1920s style attire. So I think it was just a case of what could they get their hands on, and they just whipped that together. But it works.
So you enjoyed this one then too, right?
I enjoyed this one until, again, the ending let me down a little bit, but I was curious where this was going to go.
Sabatouji! I saw my uncle pop both his eyes out one day at lunch. Oh, yeah? How'd he do it? A truck ran over him. Oh, a wise guy, eh?
Seated back there in the darkness is a man who has eaten all of his popcorn and is now greedily dipping his fingers into his friend's supply. What he needs now is an object lesson on the evils of avarice. Observe, if you will, how brightly burn the fires of greed. Fires so intense, the flames drive you to the point of no return.
These two boarders, you can see like they're down on their luck. They're living at a boarding house, so they clearly don't have a ton of money, but they're hanging out at Nigel's place, who is kind of like the caretaker on the cemetery. You know, just a very, seems like a very kind man that is just thankful for his job that's been handed down from generations, and it allows him to earn a decent living with his kittens in his little hut. And these two ne'er-do-wells, we'll call them, Leon Rippey as Freddy, Terry Laughlin as Charlie. Terry Laughlin also in Chain Gang, which you can hear our thoughts on that one in a prior episode, another Earl treasure.
Also in 3D.
Also in 3D. And it turns out that Terry's got some ideas of maybe starting to do some grave robbing to alleviate the freshly deceased of their worldly possessions.
Oh, my, yes. Fascinating one today. Mrs. Lawrence. Beautiful young lady, they tell me. Married quite a bit of money, I understand. It was consumption that took her.
Lady like that probably took quite a bit with her, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yes, certainly so.
Quite a bit of what? Her jewels, Freddie, her jewels. These rich folks, they're damnedest to take it with them when they leave, when they ought to be leaving it behind for those of us who really need it.
And he kind of ropes Freddie into this. Freddie is a little bit reluctant to get involved, but just kind of finds himself involved by happenstance and by association. And, you know, Charlie's making him do all the work, like digging up the grave, then has to jump in to alleviate the woman that was just buried of her necklaces and rings. And so he thinks he's come across like just a great money-making scheme, something that's going to allow them a chance to, you know, to get out of poverty. And, you know, as he says, you know, why should we let them just die with all this stuff? It's just there waiting to be taken. And they get word that there's a series of catacombs under a demolished church where there are a bunch of crypts and tombs. And so they think, or at least Charlie thinks, like, here's our chance for a big payday. And Nigel, was it Nigel that tells him of this originally? I don't remember.
Yeah, he kind of throws it out there. And then as you get to the ending, you can see probably why he decided to drop some of the tease that the catacombs might be filled with some valuables that Charlie and Freddie should seek out.
Yeah, it's too tempting an offer for Charlie to turn down. So he's got the big plan, and they go and accost Nigel at his home, tell me where the entrance to the catacombs are, and they go down there. And this is where, Bernie, you were saying we start to get into a bit of like cardboard set. There's a superimposed shot of the moon over like the remnants of the church, of the, you know, demolished church. And this is where it kind of let me down, because I was waiting for some more supernatural things to kind of happen. And it really just turns out that there are just a shit ton of rats down there, and the rats are the guardians of the title. And they will be feasting on anyone that comes down to try and rob anyone of the treasures. And so Freddie, unfortunately, meets an unfortunate end when he's trying to dislodge a giant piece of stone that falls on him. And Charlie realizes that he no longer has to split the spoils. So he just leaves him there buried under the stone, and then is quickly accosted by the rats, can't escape, and is killed. And thus ends segment number 2. Although I have to say, but before it ends, it does cut back on Nigel, who clearly knows what was down there. He's talking to his kitten. He's like, "Oh, well, you know, just like you, like, you know, the guardians have to be fed as well." And he kind of chuckles and goes back to his life. What kind of threw me for a loop was after the segment ends, we go back to Igor, who proceeds to tell us that Nigel, when he went back down there to reset the traps, was attacked and killed by the rats. And I'm like, what happened?
And in case you're in the neighborhood, don't bother dropping in on Nigel. He won't be home. When he returned to the catacombs to reset his traps, he became the buffet for his little friends.
If that isn't a classic case of biting the hand that feeds you, I don't know what is. You said it. They not only bit it, but chewed it off and swallowed it.
Let me eat the little rats. I'll tear them limb from limb.
Down, Fido! Send me down there. I'll pulverize them. Put a cork in your beak, porcupine head. Ow!
Okay, I get it. The rats, just like Nigel, are the guardians, right? Like they're protecting the undead, the secrets, the valuables. Then to find out that, like Igor says, talk about biting the hand that feeds you. Nigel off screen. Oh, by the way, when he tried to reset the trap, they killed him too.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess that's the end of that. All right.
You're bringing me down, Igor.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan Podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
Third segment, Visions of Sugar Plums. And this one felt like it was the longest, but this one was interesting in that this one was all over the place. It was directed by Todd Durham, who directed Hyperspace. He actually wrote and directed Hyperspace, and he is credited with having created the concept that would eventually become Hotel Transylvania.
I heard something about that. Okay, that was him. Gotcha.
But he also ghost wrote on the National Lampoon movies. So I think this is where segment 1 plays like an episode of Tales of the Crypt, right? 2 feels like an episode of the House of Hammer, which was the Hammer horror version of Alfred Hitchcock Presents type stories, right? This one, a lot of comedy in here, a lot of black comedy, a lot of weird comedy, because this one just threw me for a loop. I'm not sure if you guys fully know what you're trying to accomplish here, but the chaos of it made it interesting. Kind of fun at times.
Yeah, definitely fun at times. This one is kind of gonzo bonkers. It doesn't quite hold up for me because for a couple of, we'll talk about it. I feel like it could have gone a certain direction if you developed the grandmother a different way than she ends up being.
And just by way of context for folks that have not seen it, which is the majority of the population on the planet Earth. So you've got these parents who are on their way to Hawaii, and they drop off their 2 kids, boy and a girl, who I have to guess are probably in the 6 to 9 age range. So they're pretty young. They drop them off with grandma. They're not exactly excited about this prospect because, as the dad points out as they're driving towards grandma's house, you better get into Christmas spirit or I'm going to beat you.
Now, you two stop it. We're almost at grandma's.
How long do we have to stay there anyway?
Now, it'll just be a week. We'll be back Christmas Eve after our trip.
Why can't we go to Hawaii?
Because you're too little.
No, because you're too cheap.
One more word out of you, young man, and you're going to get a good spanking.
Real tough. Handle a little kid.
Oh, no!
You better get in the Christmas spirit, or I'm going to bust your butt.
As they're driving, and he's just swirling around, and then they get to grandma, and I think that was an interesting way to set this up because their parents seem like they're monsters, so they're going to love grandma's house.
Grandma's also confined to an electric wheelchair. So again, parenting decisions, leaving your 2 young children with grandma who physically limited, questionable choice. Also questionable choice to go to Hawaii right before Christmas and just drop your kids off with grandma. But, these 2 are not winning parents of the year.
Not at all. But I mean, that's where the story kind of goes off the rails because you get the tropey setup. Grandma should be loving. she's not. If anything,
she may be certifiable. She's certainly insane.
At one point during dinner, she's talking to her undead husband, and she has a place at the table made for him. It actually serves him food. And anytime that the kids kind of talk about being excited for Christmas and excited about Santa bringing presents, it just becomes maniacal. Grandma's responses just keep escalating and going from mean-hearted to sadistic.
Grandma, is Santa Claus going to bring us lots and lots of toys for Christmas?
What?
I was just wondering.
What?
If maybe...
What's the question?
I was just wondering if maybe Santa Claus is going to bring us lots and lots of toys this year.
Toys? Ah!
But then, you know, I really don't even want anything for Christmas this year.
Dennis, what about you?
Me?
Do you want Santa Claus to bring you anything for Christmas?
Johnny Bass Master Laser Gun?
What?
No, nothing. I can't think of anything.
That was my main issue with this story, because she starts out loving, like she's very happy to see the kids, and she's like, we're gonna have a great time, and you know, she's got the Christmas lights up, and the kids are in the woods getting the Christmas tree.
Yeah.
And Grandma is putting them to bed. She loves her grandchildren. The issue is that Grandma's on a lot of pills. She's running low. And there's a scene where she's like shaking all the empty bottles and she finds one with one. And so she takes the pill. It cuts to the next day. You get a lot of like the title cards of like December 21st, December 22nd. So
that's right.
She's good until the next day when she's now out of pills. That's when the change starts happening. Granted, it's 1984 and it's a different time, but I feel like you sell the story better if Grandma is kind of deranged to begin with, and it's not a result of her medication, because I feel like that was a bit of a cop-out on it. Because like you said, yeah, she goes further and further off the rails. She becomes maniacal. She eventually starts hunting the kids with a shotgun.
Yes, and the shotgun, a chainsaw. Like, we're not kidding. Like, it's not like she gets mean. Like, she gets just straight up homicidal.
Yeah, this is a result of her lack of medication. So again, like, I feel like if there was a different motivation for Grandma, that makes for a better story of like why she's going after her grandchildren. But it's really just the medication that's causing her to do this. And so, yeah, she goes full on crazy in the end, and the kids are running all over the house trying to hide, and the parents' flight is delayed.
Yes.
Coming back from Hawaii, so the kids call the airline. Grandma's on the other line and is like saying that the plane crashed in a horrible accident.
That was so messed up.
Eastern Reservations and Information, Dorothy speaking.
Yes, can you tell me if the flight from Hawaii has come in yet?
That's Honolulu Flight 1188. I'll check. Please hold.
Thank you for holding. Yes, Flight 1188 has unfortunately crashed into the Rocky Mountains.
All passengers were killed on impact. Thank you for holding. That flight will be approximately 5 hours late due to inclement weather conditions. Estimated arrival time is now 9:55 p.m. tonight.
What?
So messed up. Dear God, these poor kids.
It was, there's parts that were reminding me of an episode of The Little Rascals, not like the overall violence part, but it was like the kids' reactions where as Grandma's slowly going off her meds and getting crazier and crazier, like, she's like asking them, like, you expecting toys for Christmas? And the kids, it's almost like something like out of like, Spanky being like doing like a double take and be like, oh no, I don't want presents at all. But the way the kids delivered, it's like, they're clearly like very young and doing their best. And I think the reaction being general, like it reminded me of a Little Rascals episode, because those kids were, again, not actors, and the authenticity was what shined through. And it was kind of the same in this episode. Every time like the kids were meant to react off of Grandma.
There were some parts though that a bit over the top, where the kid is basically being cornered, and he's kind of doing the airplane Naked Gun type scene where he reaches behind him and sharp knife, machete, butcher knife, then he grabs a spatula. And there were like some moments where I was like, okay, like I can appreciate what you're doing. I will say, though, the ending was a bit of a surprise because, again, to spoil it for folks, parents who take a questionable trip to Hawaii, especially, during the Christmas season, arrive late on Christmas Eve. Turns out, as they're literally in the driveway of Grandma's house, we forgot the presents, probably left them at the airport, back and forth between mom and dad. Well, I don't want to go back, but, the kids are going to be disappointed. Dad's like, you know what? Screw it. I'll go back and get them. The wife being like, you know what? No, we'll go back together and then we'll come back together and we'll have the gifts.
With the kids in the window, banging on the wall, trying to get their parents' attention, trying to get out.
With crazed grandma riding around that house in her wheelchair with shotgun in hand. And then all of a sudden you think, all right, well, how are these kids going to save themselves? And my thought was, this is Macaulay Culkin, right? Like they're going to have to save themselves. And I don't see this being so dark that grandma's going to get killed, but they're going to sort of incapacitate her in some way. And maybe when mom and dad arrive, kids like, what have you done? Like grandma, and grandma's now perfectly fine again. Or maybe grandma has passed away on her own because she needed the pills, but the kids didn't do it. But no, none of that happens. Who saves the day? It's Santa Claus.
It's like, is that David Harbour?
I was thinking it was George Kennedy at one point. Who could be what David Harbour looks like when he's older too? But Santa turns grandma into a shooting star, allows mom and dad to have a nice romantic moment where mom kisses dad on the cheek. And that was grandma that they were, wishing on a star on. As she flies away, Santa does kind of like a little wink to the kids in the camera and he disappears up the chimney. And these kids are
in therapy for the rest of their life.
Every Tuesday at 2 p.m., just slot them in.
Bonkers story, bonkers episode. This is just wild.
The reason we watched this film, Pete, for folks that are thinking, man, these guys are digging deep into the 80s. Well, we didn't necessarily go willingly into this. This was a like, oh, look, Earl Owensby produced yet another 3D film, so we'll have to watch it.
Three-dimensional pictures was an idea that had come of age, and Earl began production on the first 3D movie shot in the United States in 25 years. And even though his version was an updated technique and a great improvement over the old 1950s method, this was one of the few times that Owensby didn't face things realistically. This was one time when Earl Owensby's golden touch didn't even bring in silver. Other studios caught the bandwagon and began flooding the market with 3D releases like Friday the 13th in 3D and Amityville 3D.
All these things hit, and the one that really killed it was Jaws 3 in 3D. Terrible movie, technically terrible, and they just went out en masse with it, 1,500, 2,000 prints. You can't do that on 3D. And I blame that is one thing that happened. The other thing that happened is they go into multiplexes and 3D has to be tweaked. The projectionist has to make sure that the frame is where the frame is supposed to be. If you don't have 3D. Your convergence is off. They wouldn't do that.
The 3D effects in this one, for folks that have listened to these 3D episodes, sometimes super apparent. You're getting a broom handle, a knife shoved in your face. In this one, you get Igor's hand, his eyeball, you get grandma's shotgun and the chainsaw. So in those scenes, I appreciated it that it was as much a gimmick as it was a plot device. Yeah, she's running around with a chainsaw, lunge it at the screen. Totally makes sense. Did you see any 3D effects that, popped out at you? Sorry.
Those were the two that I caught. This was the one of the three stories that really leaned into any of those shots. I feel like the vignettes with Igor looked like they were clearly shot. I mean, the arm and the head and the eyeball coming out of the screen aside, those, from what I could see on YouTube, look like they were shot and meant to have the depth of 3D. The other two stories, again, hard pressed to think of like a specific shot that would be like, yes, this is for 3D. But yeah, this one did have like the granny with the shotgun and the hedge trimmer.
A segment in the first one where they have a candlestick. It's the part where the Countess is kind of retelling the story of Dracula as a kid and just kind of like a sad tale about he was lonely. And there's a part where like there's like a candlestick and I was like, that's kind of a foreground element. If you told me that was in 3D, I would say sure. Just like in the second segment, there's a part where like one of the grave robbers, his hand is in the foreground. I think, again, just for like depth of field, maybe. Yeah. But again, like not super obvious. Nevertheless, this was in 3D, so they told us.
Yeah, so we were led to believe. some of my just random thoughts was like, I mean, before she is taken out by Santa, I mean, it really seemed like Grammy was having like the best Christmas of her life. She was loving blowing away TVs, mirrors, doors. Like, I don't know if any of that translated to 3D, but like,
oh, that's right. The holiday decorations, the globe, the pot of beans. I'd like to think all of those were basically just there where Earl Owensby's like, you know what, guys, we got the lenses. Like, screw it. Let's like do it. Come on, guys. Like, let's wrap this up. You know, I guess those in between elements that he is credited as directing, but also I saw that Worth Keeter in the credits is, and yes, folks, I did watch some of the credits because now we're at this point. Worth Keeter is listed as a supervising director. So Earl Owensby hasn't directed any of these movies we've talked about or any of the movies he released through Earl Owensby Studios. He produced them. So my guess is maybe it was necessity and maybe Worth Keeter there kind of like over his shoulder being like, hey, to get the shot. Because Worth Keeter was also the guy that Steve Miner consulted before they were going to shoot Friday the 13th in 3D.
Oh, wow.
And I read how Steve Miner was talking to Worth Keeter, and Worth Keeter is like, I can help you with this, but where's the script? And Steve Miner makes like a comeback and says, the day we have the script is the day we're going to be on set. Worth, basically, just tell me how the technology works and we'll figure it out. And I guess, sidetrack, they did have to pause production on Friday the 13th, part 3. So maybe Worth was worth his salt in Vice, who was also supervising director of these Igor scenes.
So my biggest question is, before we get to the third story and Igor's doing his thing, leading us in, we get another kind of extended shot of like the camera panning through some trees and there's an overturned
tombstone kind of thing
that looks 3D. The title card comes up for Tales of the Third Dimension. The movie's 2/3 over. So my question is, did they just wait that long to put it there, or did we somehow watch this out of order?
I saw the same thing. I read a few folks who they all just happened to see the same YouTube version of this movie we saw. This is how they mentioned it was released. And someone said it was a film so rare, I'm quoting it, that it has only been available once on home video in 1998, released as part of the EO Studios, that's Earl Owensby Studios, 25th anniversary VHS collection. Seems like that's the VHS that was then subsequently uploaded to YouTube, which is what we saw, which had the title card about an hour into the movie, right before that third segment. I have to guess at some point in the editing, they must have realized maybe the third segment works better. It's stronger. So let's finish with this and let's not start with it. And whatever happened with the print, that's the print that went out the door.
Yeah.
And I'm going to also guess Earl Owensby is kind of like one of these guys that's like, hey, Earl, that's kind of wrong. And he's like, well, how many prints did we make? Well, we already made like 30 prints and they're already out to drive-ins. And he's like, screw it. Because he wouldn't say fuck it because he's a man of God. He's a man of myth and a legend. But he'd say, screw it, guys. It's out the door. Then I guess that's what they're seeing. But the title card comes in an hour into it. And I'm sure he'd probably say, so they stayed for an hour? I got their money. That's fine. That's perfectly fine. Again, we're only watching this movie because somehow we subjected ourselves to a 3D summer watching these 80s 3D films. And because of our discovery of Earl Owensby. But I'm not going to remember this as fondly as I do on occasion, just like stumbling onto an episode that someone's uploaded of Tales of the Crypt on YouTube. Because again, another series that they have not made easy to find. Or if Fear Fest is going on and AMC throws up like Creep Show, I'm like, cool, awesome. Like anytime I pop in, I'll watch it. I know the mileage may vary. Not all the episodes are great, but it's just for the nostalgia. I'll watch it. So in some ways, this one kind of snuck in like a Rottweiler in the backseat or an Earl Owensby in the backseat of a Buick. And this wasn't terrible. It wasn't great, but because it reminds me of things that are great, this was okay. This was fun.
Yeah, again, very glad to have watched it. I don't know how many repeat viewings I will do. I could see myself maybe throwing it on like to show someone and be like, oh, you've never heard of Earl Owensby? Like, you got to watch a clip of this and maybe just, yeah, you know, the fascinating slice American film history that these things exist. Yeah, I'm just happy to kind of fill in some gaps in my viewing. I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed Chain Gang for what they were. I got some entertainment value out of it. Got some enjoyment out of it. Sounds like you did too. And Really, at the end of the day, what more can you ask for? I think Earl said it himself. He's not doing a whole lot of change in the world with these things, but if he can entertain you for a little while and, alleviate a couple of bucks from your billfold, he's okay with that.
Since you people obviously have more tenacity than I do stamina, I'm going to call it a night. The last one out can lock the gate. And what's this? No, it isn't. There are more tales of the third dimension coming your way. Watch for them. And remember, I'll keep an eye out. Just for you.